Hey, I'm Dr. Gress, and I'm here to talk to you today about the different ways that a skeletal muscle can contract, depending on whether it is creating movement, as in lifting things, resisting movement, as in holding things still, or controlling movement, as in setting things down. All right, so I'm going to give you a few examples to help you understand these different types of muscle contractions. And one of them is to talk about the erector spinae muscles. If you haven't learned about these yet in class, these are large muscles, paired bilateral muscles that run up and down either side of your spine on your back. As they run along behind the spine, they extend the spine. So they straighten up the spine. Remember, extending means to straighten up, and the erector spinae muscles straighten the spine. So I'm going to have a few videos of my son Danny demonstrating some of these things in this video. And here he is extending his spine as he stands up straight. So the erector spinae muscles are creating this movement, and what they're doing is that back here behind the spine, they are shortening as they contract, and as they shorten, they pull the vertebrae and the ribs backwards, and that extends or straightens the spine. So extension of the spine is what we call the action of the erector spinae muscles. And I just want to differentiate here quickly between the action and the function of a skeletal muscle. When you are learning facts about muscles, you'll probably learn its origins, its insertions, eventually its innervations, and you'll learn its action. The action is the movement that's produced at a joint by a muscle when it shortens. So in this case, we've got a whole bunch of joints running up and down the spine. The action of the erector spinae muscles is to extend the spine. That's the movement that they create when they contract and when they shorten. So you'll learn, for example, that the quadriceps muscles, their action is to extend the knee. The triceps brachii muscles, action is to extend the elbow. All right, so that's the movement that they create when they shorten as they create tension. We can contrast that with the function of a muscle. And you can think of the function of a muscle as sort of being its role in the body in everyday life, sort of one of the important things that it does. And sometimes the function is the same as the action, and sometimes it's not. So for example, although the action of the erector spinae muscles is to straighten the spine, and that is very important, they have another very important function, and that is to hold the torso upright. So to help us maintain upright posture requires action from those, or I shouldn't say action probably, requires activity from those erector spinae muscles. So without the erector spinae muscles being active, Danny would sort of flop over forwards. But one of the important functions of those muscles is to hold him upright, even though there's no movement happening there. So that leads us to say, well, how is a muscle contracting when there's no movement happening? Well, there are different types of muscle contractions. So we talk about a muscle contraction, but what we really mean is that when a muscle is contracting, it's developing tension. That is, it's creating a pulling force. And when, as I said, when a muscle is creating its action, for example, when those erector spinae muscles are extending the spine, they are shortening. So they are contracting in the sense that they're getting shorter. But muscles can contract, that is, develop a tension or a pulling force without shortening. But let's talk about this first type of muscle contraction first. And this is the kind of muscle contraction we've been talking about here, where a muscle creates force as it shortens. This is a type of muscle contraction called an isotonic muscle contraction. And this is a contraction, a type of muscle contraction where the muscle changes length as it develops tension. And this type of muscle contraction is called a concentric muscle contraction. So a concentric muscle contraction is when the muscle shortens as it creates tension, as it develops a pulling force. And this is what happens when that muscle creates its action. So I have a few of these little diagrams here that illustrate sort of the concepts of the different types of muscle contractions. And so what we have is a model of a muscle where you've got, this is sort of this bar up here represents a bone, and there's a muscle attached to it by a tendon at the origin. So that would be the origin of the muscle. And then at the bottom of that muscle, at its insertion, there's a weight. Now, anatomically, that could be, for example, the weight of the forearm that biceps has to move, okay? Or it could be the added weight of a weight in the hand, for example, if we're talking about biceps, and we'll see some of that in a minute. But either way, that weight represents the resistance to the muscle force. That represents how hard whatever this is pulling on this muscle. So let's say that this is biceps and this is the forearm and the hand. The forearm and the hand have a weight of 6 kilograms, okay? So if biceps is going to flex the elbow and move the forearm and the hand, it needs to develop more than 6 kilograms of force when it contracts. So if the muscle can develop greater force than this resistance, the muscle will shorten, and that resistance, that weight will be moved, okay? So if this is the forearm and the hand, and this is biceps, it has successfully flexed the elbow and moved the forearm and the hand. As that's happened, as you can see, the muscle is getting shorter. So it's truly contracting. It's getting shorter as it produces tension, and it's producing movement, and as I said, the muscle's action. So this would be an example of, as I said, moving the forearm or else lifting things. So if you were going to lift something, you would have to create a force that was greater than the weight of the object that you are going to lift. Oops. All right. So one other way I like to illustrate this is by thinking about a pair of people on a cliff. So we've got one person on top of the cliff, and we have another person dangling off of the edge of a cliff by a rope. So the guy up here is holding onto the rope. The guy down here is also holding onto the rope, okay? So you can imagine if you're standing on top of a cliff and your friend is dangling over the edge of a cliff by a rope, if you want to pull your friend up over the top of the cliff, you are going to have to generate more force than the weight of your friend down on the end of that rope there. Okay, so if you can generate more force than that person's body weight, you can pull your friend up over the cliff. So that's analogous to a concentric muscle contraction. Here is Danny lifting a weight, okay? And here we're illustrating the concentric contraction of the biceps brachii muscle. So remember, biceps brachii is here crossing anterior to the shoulder, anterior to the elbow. It's a flexor of the elbow. So when Danny's forearm, this weight I think is 12 pounds, when Danny's biceps can create more than 12 pounds of force, he can flex his elbow and he can lift that weight. And so that's a concentric contraction. His biceps is shortening as it creates that tension, and it's creating movement, and it's creating its action, which is flexion of the elbow. So that's the first type of muscle contraction and kind of the most intuitive. The second type of muscle contraction is what we call an eccentric isotonic contraction. So the one that we just looked at was also an isotonic contraction, but it was a concentric isotonic contraction. This is an eccentric isotonic contraction. In an eccentric contraction, what happens is that the muscle, instead of creating movement, controls the rate of movement in the opposite action. So let me explain that to you. So here again is our muscle model here. So we've got our 6 kilograms of weight down here. What happens if our muscle contracts and creates tension, but that tension produces less than 6 kilograms of force? If we remove that support from underneath the weight, that support is going to pull down again, or sorry, that weight is going to pull down. That weight is more force than the muscle is creating. And so instead of pulling that weight up, that weight goes down and it stretches the muscle, okay? This muscle can still be creating force, it can still be contracting and generating tension. And if it is, what it's doing is it's slowing the rate of descent of that weight. That muscle is getting longer, as you can see, as it develops tension. So the resistance down here is greater than the muscle force. As it creates tension, the muscle lengthens or stretches, and the object moves away from the muscle force. And this would be the situation if you were, say, setting something down. So if you're holding a baby in your arms, right, you could set that baby down real quick by just letting your elbows extend and flop down, but that's not going to be good for that baby. So you're going to want to gently lower that baby down. Controlling the rate of extension of your elbows is going to be an eccentric contraction from your biceps. So here's our pair on the cliff again. If this guy wants to lower his friend down on the rope, he can do it real quickly, right, by just letting go of the rope. But again, it's not going to end well for his friend. So if he wants to gently lower his friend down, he has to create a force. It's not going to be as much force as this person's body weight, but it's going to be enough to slow this person's descent down on the rope, to control how quickly that person goes down. In the case of the erector spinae muscles along the back of the spine, when you bend over, if you want to bend over, that's flexion of the spine. So you could, again, flex your spine real quickly just by flopping over, but you risk damaging a lot of sensitive soft tissues in there, like nerves and ligaments and blood vessels. And so you need to slowly bend over. You need to control the rate of flexion. Gravity will bend you over, but you can't just flop over or you hurt yourself. So those erector spinae muscles along his back are contracting in an eccentric contraction. They are lengthening as they create tension to control his rate of flexion. And that's opposite their action. Remember, their action is to extend the spine, and here he's flexing his spine. And one more example with our biceps again. So he's picked up that weight, right? And now he's holding it up and he wants to gently lower it down so he doesn't, say, drop it on his toes. That's hard, and you can see he's working hard. Even though his elbow is extending, his biceps are working hard to control that rate of extension and keep his elbow from just flopping down. So controlling extension, which is the opposite of the action of biceps, his biceps muscle is lengthening as it creates tension, as it contracts. Finally, we had isotonic contractions, right? We had concentric and eccentric. And now we have what's called an isometric contraction. Iso means same and metric means length. And in an isometric contraction, there is no change in length of that muscle. So as the muscle develops tension, it stays the same length. And this is the kind of muscle contraction we have when a muscle is resisting movement, when preventing movement from happening. So here's our muscle again. What will happen when we remove that support underneath the weight or underneath that resistance? Well, if this muscle can create exactly 6 kilograms of force, exactly the same force as the resistance, the weight won't move, the muscle's length won't change, they'll both stay the same. Okay, so this muscle is creating tension, it's contracting, but no movement is happening. And you've experienced this if you've ever had to walk around campus carrying your heavy books. You're not creating any movement there, you know, in your arms with a pile of books in your arms, but your muscles are still working hard just to resist the force of those books under the influence of gravity, just to keep those books from falling on the ground. So in an isometric contraction, the muscle force is equal to the resistance. The muscle develops tension, but the length of that muscle stays the same, and the object does not move. With our friends on the cliff here, if this man up here can create exactly the same amount of force as his friend's body weight, his friend's just going to dangle there and not go up or down. And that's analogous to an isometric contraction. Isometric contraction of the erector spinae muscles would resist flexion of the spine, would keep the spine from flexing, and wouldn't be strong enough to make the spine extend. So if Danny's going to stay in this position partway bent over, his erector spinae muscles are contracting isometrically. They're staying the same length to prevent him from either bending over or straightening up. And finally, with our biceps muscles here, you can see that he's having to work pretty hard to hold that barbell in the same place. So even though, let's see, where's my little, there we go. Even though no movement is happening, his biceps muscles are creating tension. They're contracting. They're working hard to resist the extension of the elbow that would come from this weight just pulling the forearm down. So if his biceps weren't contracting, his elbow would extend just because of gravity and that weight would go down. So this is an isometric contraction. Oops. Okay, so just to review, when muscles contract, they develop tension, they develop a pulling force, but they don't always shorten. Okay, so despite the name contraction, they don't always contract, they don't always get shorter. We've got two sort of categories of muscle contraction types. The first is an isotonic contraction, when a muscle changes length as it develops tension. In a concentric contraction, that's sort of the most, what you would think of as a typical muscle contraction. The muscle shortens as it develops tension, and it creates a movement. It creates the action of that muscle. In an eccentric contraction, the muscle lengthens as it develops tension. It stretches out as it's developing tension, so it's controlling the rate of movement. And finally, the other category is an isometric contraction. And in an isometric muscle contraction, the muscle is developing force, it's contracting, but it's staying the same length. And this would be resisting movement. All right, hope that helps you understand different types of muscle contractions. And if you have questions about this, feel free to email me.